Good Grief by Barrie Mahoney. I don't like funerals, alongside I don't like hospitals, are two comments that I often hear. Now, these comments always make me cringe, and I always feel like responding with, does anyone? But I usually manage to bite my lip and smile. It is a truism that none of us like to dwell on illness and death, but both are a fact of life that we mostly conveniently ignore until it hits us when we are at least prepared. George, our next-door neighbour, passed into the light a few days ago. He's a wonderful, kind, gentle and generous man, a delight to have as a neighbour and a friend. He loved his garden and would spend many happy hours tending plants, cutting the grass, or sitting on his garden seat, sometimes with Maureen, his wife. Over the last few years, he had been suffering terribly with dementia, which reached the final stages about 6 months ago when he was admitted into hospital. His last few days were tormented, filled with moments of anger and violence towards family, friends, and medical staff alike. The last time that I saw George was in his garden. He looked very disturbed, not at all like the George that I knew so well, and he spoke to me over the garden fence. "Please take me home. I need to go home." It took me a few moments to realise that George was asking to be taken to his parents' old home, a home that no longer existed, but only existed in his poor, tormented mind. Sometimes George would be seen wandering the streets. Occasionally he'd be collected by the police and brought home. It reached a point where he did not know his wife and son. He quickly entered a world of confusion, torment, and darkness that worsened over time. A few days ago, George's wife, Maureen, leant over the garden fence. "George died yesterday," she said bluntly, holding back the tears. Even though we'd expected this months ago, it is also a shock when death calls. I nodded and held Maureen's arm. She was shivering gently as she spoke, giving a detailed account of George's final hours. I let her speak without interruption. There's little that can be said during these moments of acute misery and shock. Yes, it was a blessing that he avoided more distress, but that doesn't take away the feeling of loss and sadness. After a few minutes, I asked, "When's the funeral likely to be? We'd like to be there." "Oh no, there won't be a funeral. George isn't having one. I'm not having one either. There's no point. George is gone. He won't be there. Why should we spend all that money?" I nodded. After a lengthy pause, I asked, "Will you be there at the cremation?" "No. The undertaker will see him off, but I'll put his ashes in the garden." "I thought maybe over there," said Maureen briskly, pointing to a bare patch of earth in the garden. Funerals are not for the departed, but for those left behind. Many believe that the souls of the departed are present, but no one knows for certain. The funeral serves the important purpose of helping those left behind to begin the grieving process and to say their final goodbyes. There is comfort in letting shared tears flow at fond memories, as well as smiling and laughing together when remembering amusing incidents and particular sayings of the departed. Perhaps a favourite piece of music will be played, a favourite hymn sung, a favourite poem or prayer read. Sometimes funerals are the only times that families meet together after many years estranged from one another. Funerals are often occasions where bitterness, arguments, regrets and misunderstandings are finally put aside. It is a time to forgive and move on when we're reminded that none of us can escape death, and that we're all walking towards it. No, I don't like funerals either, but I have learned to realise how important they are in our circle of life. Yes, they are expensive, and in these times of financial hardship, the options must be carefully considered. In the last century, burials were the usual way of dealing with the earthly remains of the departed, and cremation was often seen as the less respectful and unpleasant option. Indeed, it was only in the 1960s that the Catholic Church, for example, finally agreed to cremations as an alternative to burial. Currently, we have a problem when dealing with death. We're fast running out of land for burials to be freely and economically available to all who want them. Cremations are now being seen as environmentally damaging by releasing toxic gases and pollution. Alternative services such as terramation, which is human composting, and aquamation of bodies, which is alkaline hydrolysis of the departed, are now available and being promoted as suitable environmentally preferred options to cremation. I'll miss George. Our home and neighbourhood won't be the same without him. It would have been comforting to share grief as well as our memories of him. I don't need a funeral to say the things that I want to say. I can say all that I want to say in the stillness of meeting or in the peaceful silence of an evening looking onto the garden that George loves so much. You have been listening to Good Grief by Barrie Mahoney, and if you'd like to find out more about me and my books, please go to my website barriemahoney.com. Thank you for listening.